What if the angriest comments about God were actually the deepest cries for him in some cases? Let's talk about it.
Coming from the wild, from the rain and the stone, where the wind has no name and the traveler's alone. There's warmth in the fire and truth in the tale of the watcher who walks where the bold-hearted fail.
He carries no sword, yet the darkness gives way to the lantern he lifts at the end of the day. He stands on the watchtower, still and unswayed, where the lost find a path through the fog and the fray. Pilgrims Grey, oh steward of lands, you carry the light in your weather-worn hands. A tale at the hearth, a guide through the night. You open the gate between the wrong and the right.
All right, folks, welcome to Pilgrims Grey Chronicles. Robert Clark, your host. This week on Pilgrims Grey Chronicles, we are going to be stepping into the digital Mars Hill, a noisy world of comment threads, mockery, and moral debate, from alien theories to accusations of divine cruelty. We're going to confront the loudest objections and reveal the ancient hunger buried beneath them. So, what if the arguments today that I'll be presenting to you from folks aren't the end of belief, but rather the beginning of a bigger conversation, right? We may have some people that seem angry or bitter on the outside, or just some people are just asking genuine questions, and they might come across a little hostile just because they've experienced so much bitter disappointment. The world sucks, and they're angry at God and blame him for it. And I totally get that. And we're going to comment on some of that and kind of do some story form stuff. Because we know the internet is sort of the new Athens, right? Everyone has a podium, but no one has a pause button. Here they gather, right? The moral relativists, skeptics, cynics, the wounded believer, and every one of them scrolls through the feed like the Athenians of old, right? Ever hearing some new thing. And yet, just as Paul once said, what you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The same gospel still steps into the digital crowd, not with pride, but with patience, right? That is what we are looking for. Some patience as we walk the long road with our lanterns lit high, like the gentleman here in this illustration in the video. So you can kind of almost hear them, right? All these folks. I've got my glasses on again, hard to see. I've been doing a lot of commenting over the weekend, probably more than I should have. I found it really frustrating this weekend because, again, those of you who are listening who aren't podcasters might not understand this, but those who are, any of my friends who are listening who are have a podcast, a lot of effort goes into these things, and to have people just dismiss some of the things that you're saying based off not even the content of your podcast that they can't be bothered to go listen to. They comment on just an image on it or the basic outline of it or just a question you've asked and don't even bother to take time or effort to go into the rest of it. And many of those comments I just ignore, but some of them I don't. And I comment. Maybe not so much for the person who's made the comment, since many of them can be rude or vulgar, but more for Christians who are reading these things and might need some support, so to speak, or maybe you've had a question about something, or you've heard this question before and didn't know how to answer it. That's why I'm doing this series of podcasts, so that if you want to, you can download the transcript from Spreaker and just use what I said. If you can't think of it, you can just say, well, I heard a podcast that answered this very thing, and and you can either share the podcast with them, Or if you want to, although when I say that, many of these mockers will say, well, see, you're just pointing them to your podcast so you can get views for money. If I wanted to do that, I would hype up every single podcast with the clickbait thing. I'm not doing that, and I'm not about that. And any of you who are regular listeners know this. And I'm not making any money, trust me. So it requires time, effort, and resources coming out of my own pocket to put out a podcast, at least currently. Would I like to make money? Sure. Who doesn't want to make money? But that is not my sole objective, or I would have quit long ago. So my main objective is I like sharing truth. I love God. And this is one way that I can reach a larger audience than just the people around me to present what God has presented to me and help me to understand. Do I understand everything? No, I only understand so far what God has revealed to me. I don't know everything. I only know what God has revealed to me so far, and that I feel like God has made it pretty clear that I should try to share it in many different ways, not just with a podcast, but with how I love my neighbor here locally as well, which I do, because I've heard it from fellow Christians that, well, you shouldn't be just doing a podcast. You should be, I am, okay? I am doing that. We make so many assumptions online about people just because they say something or do something. It's just unbelievable to me. Just assume, that I am very aware of, and I'll assume the same in you. I'll assume the same good in you until shown otherwise, right? But anyway, we're doing sort of a Mars Hill thing here, and you can almost hear, if you can imagine being there with the crowd, and that's what I want to kind of get you in the mood here for. Imagine you're back at that Acropolis. You're there in Mars Hill, only we're in kind of a more modern day Mars Hill today, right? And you can hear the kind of things that are said, right? Good and evil are human opinions. Religion only controls the weak. Your God condones slavery. I mean, my gosh, how many times have we heard that God condones everything horrible in the world, right? Simply because they write about it in Scripture. Context doesn't matter, just it's there, so God supports it. And and also it's all aliens and evolution. Don't forget that one. That's another one I heard. Every one of these echoes, offer the same ache. Show me something real is really what they're asking. And I begin to understand this from listening to people like Carl Tykrib opening his brilliant, tint to the unknown God or over at the Burning Man thing. I think it's brilliant. And so we answer some of these comments, not with fury, but with reason. And because disagreement doesn't destroy truth, it reveals that people still believe there is something worth finding, right? So even mockery in its own strange way bows to meaning. For no one ridicules what they think is utterly irrelevant, right? You wouldn't waste your time. So I'm going to go into a brief story here. Maybe not so brief, but it's a story of entering the digital marketplace. So the digital marketplace hums with restless energy, a modern day Mars Hill, where ideas clash in the open air of the internet. I step into this neon lit bazaar of beliefs and doubts, posting a truth I hold dear, right? And almost at once the voices gather around, curious, skeptical, some combative, much as the philosophers did around Paul on that ancient hill. A chorus of notifications announces their arrival, and the debate on Mars Hill begins. I've also got some cute little things to show you while we do that. See if I can find it here. Boom. All right. And I'll switch over to that so you can see it better. All right. Pretty cool, huh? I don't know why it's not looping like it's supposed to. Let's loop it. There we go. So one commenter steps forward from the crowd of avatars, questioning the very premise of objective morality. His words appear on the screen like a challenge etched in digital stone. Good and evil are human inventions. Morality is just a social construct, different for every culture. There are no absolute rights or wrongs. The voice of relativism rings out, clear and confident, dismissing the idea of any universal moral truth. And so I pause, hearing not just the argument, but the hunger beneath it. Gently, I reply, my fingers finding words as carefully as if speaking to a friend across a fire. If good and evil are only inventions, why do injustices feel so real? I ask. When we witness cruelty, a child abused, the innocent bombed, something in us cries out from the core of our being. We know it's wrong, even if no one else does. That knowing transcends upbringing or culture. It's as if a law is written on our hearts, one we didn't simply invent. My response flows in a measured tone, not to win an argument, but to invite him deeper. I speak of an absolute good that anchors all our visions of justice. I admit the evils done in the name of religion and progress alike, but point out how those very evils betray a standard beyond ourselves. The relativist falls silent now, and I sense him pondering the flicker of a deeper question in his mind. Could there be a real moral lawgiver behind the moral law? But then another voice rises from the agora of comments, this one weighted with disillusionment and hurt. A deconstructionist. Anonymous but achingly familiar, types out his story in a few cutting sentences. I've seen behind the curtain of the church, and it's all man made. The Bible has edited and twisted over centuries. I believed it once, but I won't be fooled again by myths and fairy tales used to control people. Now, his words carry the bitterness of betrayal and the resolve of someone who tore his old beliefs to pieces, right? Hoping to find something true in the rubble. Now, I hear not an enemy, but a wounded soul. Gently, I acknowledge his pain. You're right about one thing. People have misused God's name, and the church is far from perfect. I type slowly, imagining myself speaking these words face to face. You felt lied to. That trust was broken, and it makes you question everything now. Many of us have been down that road of doubt too. So I don't judge his criticism of Scripture. Instead, I agree that on the surface, the Bible is an ancient book penned by flawed men. But I share now, despite the flaws of its followers, the message of love and redemption within has a strange way of enduring. Perhaps those older stories and myths you mentioned are humanity's attempts to grasp the divine, I suggest. And maybe the Bible carries a voice that speaks to that longing in a way that's more than just myth. A voice that still speaks to me, even after all of my questions. I found something real in there, like a light that won't go out. And my reply isn't a sermon, just the earnest testimony of a traveler who stumbled and risen again. The deconstructionist doesn't fire back right away. I imagine him on the other side of the screen, arms folded, but heart just a little softened, uncertain what to do with this mix of honesty and hope. And in the silence, I sense it, a hunger for something true and pure, untainted by the hypocrisy he's seen. And then, while pondering this, a sharp laugh cuts through the dialogue, the unmistakable tone of a mocker. His comment pops up like graffiti on a marble pillar. LOL, you still believe in a sky fairy. Pure comedy. All this talk of gods and meaning. What a joke. Others in the thread toss up laughing emojis in agreement, and the modern Areopagus has its share of hecklers, just as Paul had those who sneered at the resurrection. The mocker's words drip with sarcasm, a defense mechanism of someone who trusts in nothing and makes fun of everything. And for a moment, I consider ignoring the jeer. Feeding trolls only encourages them, after all, right? But instead, I respond with calm courtesy, addressing not just him, but anyone listening in the crowd. I get it. It does sound crazy at first glance. I confess with a light touch of humor that yes, believing in things unseen in an eternal God might seem like foolishness in a cynical age. Mock if you want, I write, but ask yourself, why does this conversation bother you enough to comment? Could it be that deep down even laughter cannot drown out the question we all carry? And there's no immediate answer. The mocker goes quiet, perhaps surprised I didn't lash back, and the laughter in the thread dies down. In the ancient marketplace, some may have rolled their eyes at Paul, yet others leaned in despite themselves. Here, too, I sense that behind the mockery lies a curiosity, unacknowledged, a yearning to see something real, something worth not mocking. And then comes an interjection from the fringe, a perspective neither atheist nor traditionally religious. And I'm going to do this because I can. A perspective neither atheist nor traditionally religious, an ancient alien theorist enters the fray, tying our discussion to mysteries of the cosmos. Ever considered it was aliens all along, he writes? Ancient cultures, the Bible included, were just trying to describe extraterrestrial visitors. Angels, miracles, even creation could have been advanced beings from another star. Humanity's gods were extraterrestrials in the distant past. Now, his words swirl conspiracy and curiosity together, a modern echo of the Athenians' altar to an unknown god. And here is someone groping for an explanation beyond the mundane, trading Yahweh for UFOs, but still seeking something greater out there, right? So I reply with genuine intrigue, meeting him where he is. The universe is vast and fascinating, no doubt, I acknowledge. Maybe there are other beings out there. God's creation is full of wonders. But even if ancient aliens seeded life, right, just if, we'd still have to ask who made the aliens? Who set the stars in place for them to travel? And I let that question hang for a second. I have found it's not aliens versus God thing. If anything, the immensity of the cosmos and the strange stories in ancient texts tell me that we humans have always felt we're not alone. We sensed a greater presence, whether we called it a deity or something from the stars. I then gently share a thought. What if those longings, yours or mine or anybody, the ancients, pointing to something or someone real behind them all? Right? What if they point to something bigger than any extraterrestrial, an author of the universe itself? And there's a brief pause in the thread. The alien theorist reacts with a single emoji, the thoughtful face. It's a small sign, but enough, and he came looking for evidence of aliens. Perhaps he caught a glimpse of God instead, hiding in plain sight behind the wonder of the heavens. So the hunger for awe is there, just misnamed. And in this quest for extraterrestrial truth, I see a yearning for transcendence. And finally, amid the dwindling debate, a weary voice speaks up, quieter than the rest. The cynic has been listening all along, and now he unloads a bleak observation. But first, some water. Look around. Doesn't matter if it's gods or aliens or moral laws, the world's still a mess. People are selfish, life is cruel, and nothing really changes. In the end, nothing matters. We're born, suffer, and die. That's it. So his words fall like lead on the forum floor, heavy with despair. This isn't a troll or a philosopher sparring for sport. This is a soul bruised by reality, one step away from nihilism. In his radical skepticism, I hear an ancient echo too, the voice of Stoic philosophers who saw life as fate and loss, or perhaps the bitter resignation of those who've seen too much pain. So his comment hangs in the air, and for a moment, I don't type, I just feel the weight of it. Others in the thread are silent too. How to answer the darkness that he sees? Just because I don't. Finally, I take a deep breath and respond from the heart. You're not wrong about the pain. There is so much that's broken. And I scroll through the memories of news headlines and personal losses, letting him know I truly see it too. And I can't blame you for feeling like it's all pointless sometimes. My words appear slowly, each one honest. But if nothing matters, why do we yearn for it to matter? If life is truly meaningless, why do we grieve the injustice and hurt? And why do we hunger for meaning, for love that lasts, for goodness that means nothing? And I let that paradox sink in. Maybe, just maybe, the very fact that your heart cries out, this is not how it should be, means you believe deep down that there is a way it should be, that there's a purpose we're meant for, even if it's hidden from us for now. And I go on to share, not a lecture, but my own hope. I've found a hope that even the darkness can't extinguish, a faith that the story isn't over, that broken as things are, there is a God who entered our mess, who cares, and who will one day wipe every tear. And it might sound like a fairy tale to you, but to me, it's the only thing that makes the suffering and striving mean something. And I conclude softly, you're not alone in feeling how you do. I just want you to know that I believe there's more to this life, and you matter more than you think. Now, for a long while, the cynic's cursor blinks, and then a brief reply. Maybe I'll think about it. It's just 3 words, but they shine out on the screen like a candle in a cave. In those words, I see it, a spark or a tiny crack in the armor of despair letting a beam of light in, a hunger for hope, even if he almost feared to admit it. So the debate on this modern Mars Hill winds down. One by one, the digital figures fade back into anonymity. Some, like the mocker, have already left to laugh somewhere else. Others linger in the semi-darkness of that online forum, quietly pondering. And I lean back in my chair, which always pops when I lean back too far, heart full as if I had stood in Athens itself in the book of Acts after Paul spoke on Mars Hill. Some mocked and others said, "We will hear you again on this." And a few believed. Here in our age, on this virtual hill of debate, the pattern holds, right? There are scoffers and seekers, cynics and believers all mingled together under the neon glow of the internet. And so I log off with a final thought echoing in my mind. Behind every argument lies a soul's cry. The more relativist, who denies absolute truth, still longs for justice that is not fickle, right? The deconstructionist who broke his faith to pieces still searches those pieces for something real. The mocker masks yearning with laughter, craving a meaning sturdy enough to matter. And the alien theorist scanning the stars is really looking for our true home. And the cynic, drowning in darkness, hungers for light but fears hope's disappointment. In each of those voices on Mars Hill, ancient or modern, I recognize an altar to an unknown God, like Carl Teichert says, an ache for the divine they can't yet name. And as the screen goes dark, I whisper a prayer for my fellow pilgrims of the digital age, you folks listening right now. May their hunger lead them as it led me to the feast that satisfies. On this Mars Hill of the internet, the debate will continue, but beneath the clash of words, the human heart still gropes for God, hoping someone will say, "What you worship as unknown, I proclaim to you now." And with that being said, because that was just a story, and the reality is much harsher, believe me, when I tell you that going into these things in the modern age, um, it is far more unpleasant than what I just described. And so I'm going to share some of the comments with you and go over them quickly so we don't go too much over an hour, um, that I actually engaged with. Although I did use some of the actual things that I heard in that story. It's not all just made up. I just wanted to illustrate in that what we're dealing with. So here is, I won't use any last names. And in this case, I'll just use the person's screen name or whatever, because he doesn't use his last name. It's Josh the Heretic. And he says, you make an unsupported assertion that objective morality exists. You don't even believe that yourself. You believe in divine command theory, which is by definition subjective in the mind of God. So I responded by saying, Josh, actually, I don't subscribe to strict divine command theory. DCT makes morality dependent on whatever a deity happens to command, which would make it arbitrary. So the moral argument, as I've explained, rests on something deeper, God's nature, not just his commands. In other words, God doesn't declare something good because he says so. He declares it because he is. It's a big difference, the very standard of goodness itself. And that's what makes moral values objective rather than subjective. They're not based on changing opinion or divine whim, but on the immutable character of a maximally great being, like we pointed out in our first apologetic video on the argument from ontology, the ontological argument. So even if you grant hypothetically that commands come from God, they'd still be consistent with his moral essence, holiness, justice, mercy, and love. And that's why things like love, honesty, and compassion are always right everywhere. And cruelty or deceit are always wrong everywhere, even though some people make excuses for it to try to justify it, right? You don't have to come up with excuses for doing what is right universally. So no, it's not subjective. It's ontologically grounded in the one whose being, his very being, defines what good even means. I hope that makes sense. All right. And this one, I can't read his entire argument because it's super duper duper long. But he made, let's see, how many did I have here? 7 points. And I just answered them with short things here. So I said, I appreciate how carefully you've laid out your thoughts. This is a kind of exchange I actually enjoy, and that's why I took time to respond, or I just would have ignored it. Not because I ignore people on purpose. It's just I'm getting so much comment. I mean, this latest Facebook thing just keeps growing. I'm at somewhere around 250,000 views on this particular video, and almost 1,000 comments, and some 6,000 or 7,000 interactions or something like that. I don't know. It took off more than any other video for whatever. It must have struck a chord. Primarily by people like at Mars Hill. They're mostly, I mean, I got plenty of amens as well, but anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked. So I said you've hit most of the classic objections to the ontological, moral, and free will arguments, but each one rests on some misunderstandings worth unpacking. So this person actually responded to all 3 videos we've done so far, and I've done them in this order: ontology, or the ontological argument, the moral argument, and then I discuss the problem of evil with free will and God's middle knowledge being an explanation for it. If you haven't watched those 3 videos, please check them out. If you're a Christian, you'll find great ways to explain these ideas to people. And if you're not a Christian, or you're somebody that is wondering about these kinds of things, then that's what it's there for. So the first thing he dealt with was the ontological argument. And I said, let me get a drink of water. So I said, the ontological argument isn't a word trick. It's an exploration of necessary existence. It doesn't start by defining maximally great as the Christian God, but as a being possessing maximal excellence in every possible world, right? Omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection. Once that's logically granted, the question becomes whether necessary existence belongs to that being's essence. Because if necessary existence is even possible, such a being logically must exist in all possible worlds, including ours. So your dragon analogy breaks, because greatness in that case is comparative, one dragon stronger than another. The argument isn't about degrees of power, but the logical necessity of a being whose non-existence would be impossible. I know I didn't get to read his dragon analogy, but if you want, you can go to our Facebook site at Pilgrims Grey Chronicles. Just do a search for us on Facebook. We're there, and you can search and find his comment. And there's 800 comments to go through, and I try to respond to as many as I can, but sometimes I just don't get the notification. And sometimes I've responded to some and I want to respond, but I'm at work or there's something going on and I don't get opportunity to do so. And it's sometimes hard to find those comments. Wading through them is like finding a needle in a haystack sometimes. And then his second one was on free will and foreknowledge. So my response was, knowing and causing are 2 different things. God's knowing what you will freely do doesn't determine that you do it. Middle knowledge, or Molinism, holds that God knows what any free creature would do in any possible circumstance, and sovereignly actualizes a world in which his purposes and human choices coincide. That's not determinism. That's foreknowledge of genuinely free decisions. Your train track example confuses predicting with knowing. God's knowledge isn't temporal prediction. It's atemporal awareness of all space-time simultaneously. And then number 3, on the cross and the price of sin, I said, the reason Christ's suffering, however brief in time, pays an infinite debt isn't because of duration, but who he is. The moral weight of an offense is proportional to the dignity of the one offended. Sin against an infinite God carries infinite consequence. Thus, only an infinite being can bear it. The measure isn't temporal pain, but ontological worth. I hope that makes sense to you. And then the genocide objection. Number 4. No believer delights in those passages, but context matters. The Canaanite cultures were irredeemably depraved and possibly not even human. In fact, I don't think they were. They were, well, it would take a long time to flesh it out, but go study every culture's story of humanity interbreeding with creatures that came from the sky. Nephilim, Raphaim, Anunnaki, you name it. Every culture has a story of it in our ancient culture, before the flood, shortly after the flood. So to dismiss it as a fairy tale, that's on you if you just want to ignore history. And then ritual child sacrifice, bestiality, systemic violence, all of these things they were engaged in. And God's judgments were judicial, not ethnic. Temporal acts of divine justice, not genocidal impulse. Yet even then, repentance spared individuals, right? Rahab, Nineveh are 2 examples. Rahab was a Moabite. So your Red Army example confuses human restraint with divine justice. The Red Army was capable of rape and massacre and often did both. The moral question is not who did worse, but who defines righteousness. The God who gives life has the right to take it. What he forbids us to do is to take life unjustly. That's the difference. So the moral comparison just isn't there. Plus, you need to dig deeper into the context. And then 5, morality and survival strategy. Evolutionary ethics can explain why cooperation benefits survival, but not why it's right. If morality merely aids the species, then if rape or murder ever benefited survival, they'd be good, right? But we instinctively know that they are not. So that moral intuition points beyond just mere biology to a transcendent moral lawgiver. And expanding the circle of empathy doesn't create moral truth. It only reflects the image of the one who already wrote the law on our hearts. Number 6 was an appeal to emotion. So I said, you're right that emotion doesn't prove truth, but moral hunger isn't mere emotion. It's existential evidence. We all thirst for justice, love, and meaning because we're made for a moral reality greater than ourselves. Right? Just like hunger points to food. So 7, on God's subjective morality, he gives us the Euthyphro dilemma. And I already did it in the argument, but I just let him know with his examples that it fails because it's a false dichotomy. Morality doesn't come from arbitrary divine decree or from an external standard above God. I went into Platonism and all of that, and I said it's grounded in his very being. God is not subject to goodness. He is goodness. His nature defines moral reality the way light defines illumination. So as for Job, because he brought up Job, so often people do, and that's fine. I get it. The story's point isn't divine gambling. It's revelation. Job learns that God's justice and wisdom transcend our limited grasp. Yet he ends up saying, I had heard of you, but now my eyes see you. Right? And what about Job's example? Though he slay me, yet I will trust him. Right? That's one of my life verses. And Job's restoration wasn't proof that God is cruel. It's proof that even in suffering, his sovereignty is never divorced from love. Or let me say it a different way for somebody who mocked me on my mispronunciation. Sovereignty. Sorry, I just had to add that. Because somebody commented, sovereignty doesn't rhyme with serenity. And that's fine, whatever. You say a million words sometimes in a podcast, and you're going to trip eventually. And then we had a gentleman by the name of Dow, who said, religion is not a base for morality. Morality is taught at home. No church will do it for you, right? And I get that. And so I said, Dow, I think you're actually describing epistemology, how we learn or come to know moral principles, rather than ontology, which deals with why those moral principles exist at all in the first place. And so for you to discover epistemically, right? So parents, culture, and experience may teach morality, but they don't create it. And so the question isn't who teaches right from wrong, it's why they exist as real categories at all. So if moral truth is merely a human construct, then every culture's version is equally valid. That means no one can ever be objectively wrong. Not even the oppressors, slavers, or abusers we all agree to condemn. So when we say religion isn't the source of morality, that's partly true. God is. Religion is merely man's attempt, although too often a poor one, to describe what's already woven into creation. I hope that that helps. And then we had Jeff, who says that that's some fancy footwork you're going on there. If you need God to decide what is right and what is wrong, maybe, just maybe, you aren't the good person you think you are. So, a lot of non-believers are really good people, and unlike many supposed Christians, actually put the Christ teachings into practice even though they do not believe in a God. We have a lot of people claiming to believe who do some pretty awful, hateful things that are clearly opposed by the Bible or common decency. The thing is, if he just listened to the podcast, he would have known. So I said, Jeff, I actually agree with you. Many non-believers act more ethically than some who claim faith. Jesus himself warned about hypocrisy in his name more than almost anything else. But that isn't what this argument is about. The moral argument isn't claiming that only believers behave morally. It's asking why morality exists at all. In other words, what makes good objectively good and evil objectively evil? If there's no transcendent standard beyond human opinion, like a compass point for north, then good just becomes what each person or culture decides it is. So when you call hypocrisy or hatred wrong, you're already affirming that there's a real moral law, something higher than us, which is exactly what the argument points to, premise 2, right? Objective moral values and duties exist. We all live that way. We all acknowledge it. Until we need the argument to be wrong, and then we try to say that everything is subjective. But we don't live that way, and you don't act like that, and you don't want others to act like that, believe me. You don't. Because if somebody subjectively decides they want to off you and take away with your goods, and it's just their opinion, what do we do at that point? Then it becomes whoever's got the biggest weapons and strength. And so then we have a gentleman by the name of Brian, who says good and evil are human concepts generally applied to things describing how they affect the human condition. Morality is relative. An atheist can have better morals than a Christian. So the definition of the word is a bit fuzzy. And so you can see there's a pattern to this, which is, it's kind of the same comments over and over again. I wish I could just, like, Facebook, I don't think will let me pin one answer to all of these. So I said, Brian, I think you're right that people, Christians or atheists, can behave morally or immorally. The question, again, isn't who behaves better. It's why any behavior can be called good or evil in the first place. So saying good and evil are human concepts assumes that they only exist in our heads, but then your comment still uses those same moral categories as if they're real and meaningful. That's the contradiction. If morality is truly relative, then even saying an atheist can have better morals than a Christian completely loses its meaning because better implies a real objective standard of good. So the moral argument isn't about religious superiority. It's about the foundation, which is ontology. If good and evil are just social preferences, then they have no more binding authority than fashion trends or what your favorite breakfast cereal is. But if they're real moral truths, then they must be rooted in something or someone beyond human opinion. I think it's a someone. And I've argued that in the podcast. And then we have Neil, who says, that's not an argument. That's an unsubstantiated opinion. It's substantiated. Oh, sorry. That's an unsubstantiated opinion. And so, unfortunately, Neil, like so many, is only responding to the syllogism that the argument points to. So I said, Neil, The short image post isn't the argument, it's a summary of it, a syllogism. The full argument with evidence and philosophical reasoning is laid out in the actual podcast episode linked in the post. The claim is substantiated there. You just have to listen before assuming it isn't. The syllogism is meant to outline the logic, not present all the supporting premises in one picture. I cannot tell you. The reason I'm including that in this show, even though I didn't necessarily want to, is because I must have had 100 comments that are geared towards that, just responding to a syllogism, never even listen to the supporting arguments in the podcast. And then Richard here. What if morals are as made up as the gods? Some things that are considered morally right in one nation may be considered wrong in a different one, since morality is not universal. It is not proof of God's existence. So I said, Richard, I understand what you mean. Moral disagreement exists across cultures, but disagreement about what's moral doesn't prove morality is imaginary. It just shows people perceive it differently. People disagree about mathematics, logic, or justice too, but we don't conclude that those things are just made up, right? We assume there's a real answer. We just don't all see it clearly, right? And that's the point of the moral argument. The very fact that we argue about right and wrong presupposes that there is a real standard to discover and argue about. So the question isn't whether morality is universal in practice, it's whether it's real in principle. And if real moral truths exist, they need a foundation beyond human opinion, right, for you to appeal to. And then Dawn. She quotes Susan B. Anthony, and here's the quote. I distrust those who know so well what God wants. It always coincides with their own desires. And so she continues and says, the Bible teaches our prayers must align with our God's desire, not our own people. I don't understand prayer because they treat it like asking a magic genie for wishes, right? So what I said was, Don, Susan B. Anthony's quote is memorable, but it assumes people project their own desires onto God, and some do. And that's exactly what Scripture warns against. The Bible teaches the opposite, that prayer and discernment are about bringing our will into alignment with His, not bending His will to ours, right? If you read John chapter 14, verses 13 and 14 through 14, or 1 John 5:14, true faith means letting God define truth and morality through His word, so we don't fall into the trap of creating a God in our own image. So I'm not claiming to know perfectly what God wants. I don't know. I only know what He reveals to me, one thing at a time. And we're simply letting Him speak for Himself through Scripture, and that's how we avoid turning faith into wish fulfillment or ideology, or what's the term everybody's using? I'll manifest what I want. Well, whatever. Involve yourself with witchcraft then, because that's what that really is. So I'm trying to read through these quickly because there's a number of them, but they address a number of different questions that I want you to be able to answer when they're shot at you, right? And I know you're listening to the podcast and you think, well, I won't be able to remember them later. Well, go to where we are on Spreaker, because Spreaker, I have it set up so it always makes a transcript of the show. And then you can just go through the transcript, and if you want to copy and paste my answer to somebody, or just share the whole show with somebody to address many of these questions that many people often ask. I just basically wrote down all the Mars Hill stuff, the questions people asked while I was at Mars Hill, and then wrote down my responses, and I'm just telling you what they are in case you're ever on your own Mars Hill and you need a response and you may not know the answer. So John here says, if objective moral values and duties exist, it's because some humans have a conscience. It does not require a magical being in the sky for humans to know what behavior is wrong. It takes experience and compassion. We learn it for ourselves. So, John, you're right that humans can learn empathy and moral awareness through experience, but that only explains how we come to know right and wrong, not why they exist at all, right? Are you beginning to see the difference between epistemology and ontology here. Many people confuse the two, and they think that how we come to know is why they exist. But how would we even come to know them without an explanation as to why they're there for us to discover and know? So a conscience can't tell us that murder or betrayal are wrong, but it can't make them objectively wrong. If moral truth is only something humans invent or evolve, then it changes with the tribe, right? Or the time or the culture. And there's no ultimate reason why compassion should be better than cruelty, except that, we just happen to prefer it right now, right? So the moral argument isn't about needing a magical being in the sky. It's that for objective moral values to be real and binding, not just feelings or instincts, they require a moral lawgiver whose nature defines goodness itself. Otherwise, morality becomes descriptive, like, hey, we like kindness, right? Instead of prescriptive, we ought to be kind, right? Big difference. And so experience and compassion are how we perceive morality. God's unchanging nature is why morality exists in the first place. And then we have Scott, who says, I can have morals without worshiping a child rapist God. I don't need to ritually drink blood or eat flesh to know right from wrong. I don't need human sacrifices to know priests and presidents that have raped kids need to go to prison. Yeah. The world is an interesting place. I wonder if Paul ever dealt with comments like that. I'm sure he did. I mean, he was stoned. So, I mean, not stoned, but, like with rocks. Not with the magic lettuce. So I said, Scott, I get that you're angry, and honestly, we should be angry at evil, but none of what you described actually represents biblical Christianity. First of all, no Christian worships a child rapist God. God condemns all sexual abuse and perversion. You can see Matthew 18:6 for that. The very moral outrage you feel about those crimes actually affirms that you believe in real moral standards, or that objective moral values and duties exist. And that's the heart of what the moral argument explores. If moral truths are real, they must come from something greater than human opinion. Second, communion. Eating flesh and drinking blood isn't cannibalism or human sacrifice. It's symbolic, remembering the self-sacrifice of Christ, who gave his life to defeat sin and evil once for all. It's the exact opposite of what you're describing. And I think there are some Roman Catholic traditions that say that it magically turns into that. I think they're wrong. But if you want to debate that, that's fine too. And then finally, I said, so your anger at injustice is justified, but the very concept of injustice only makes sense if there's a real objective difference between good and evil. And that's precisely what points us back to the moral foundation of a holy and loving God, not away from him. All right. I'm going to have to abbreviate this one, I think, because this one, I really wanted to reply to this one, even though it was a bit long, because he basically says there are two completely separate kinds of morality, basic and cultural, and then he goes on to explain what they are, and you'll get the idea of what he explained by how I reply. But if you want to, you can go to the Facebook site and see his actual comment in full. In fact, there's a kind of an exchange between the two of us that goes on for another 2 or 3 comments. But what I said in reply was, Dev, this is a very thoughtful breakdown, but it confuses moral function with moral foundation. What you call basic morality describes how morality operates within human groups, but it doesn't explain why those moral truths are actually binding. Saying that we evolved morality because it helps us survive just describes a strategy, not a standard. Evolution can explain why cooperation feels beneficial, but it can't explain why cruelty is actually wrong. If morality is merely a social contract for survival, then genocide or betrayal could be moral if they ensured a tribe's survival. And history proves many cultures did indeed act that way. So the moral argument asks a deeper question. Why is trustworthiness or compassion truly good, not just useful? Survival value doesn't make something morally right. After all, deception and domination often help the fittest survive. Yet our conscience tells us that oppression is evil even when it benefits us. That points beyond evolution to something transcendent, a moral law that exists whether or not it benefits us. And as for religious codes mixing cultural customs, that's true for man made religion, but not for the God of Scripture. The Ten Commandments aren't tribal, they are moral universals. Do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness apply across all times and cultures precisely because they come from a moral lawgiver whose nature defines what justice is. So you've described the mechanism of moral behavior pretty darn good, but it's not its origin or authority. That's the difference between sociology and ontology, between describing what people do and explaining why they ought to do it. That's a huge difference also. And then Ken here says, I've seen animals show compassion and fear for other species, and they have no God. Ken, that is true. Animals can show compassion, cooperation, and even grief. But what they don't show is moral awareness. When a lion kills a zebra, we don't say it murdered the zebra and haul it into a court of law. It simply acted on its instinct. Morality isn't just about behavior, it's about oughtness, the awareness that we should or should not act a certain way. And humans uniquely ask moral questions. They feel guilt for violating unseen laws and reflect on justice even when it costs us survival advantage. And that's not an evolved instinct, that's conscience. And conscience points to something higher than nature because nature doesn't care about right or wrong, only survival. So while animals show empathy, only humans show moral accountability. And that's exactly what the moral argument is about. Not where feelings come from, but where moral truth comes from. I'm just basically having to say sort of the same thing in different ways. Because the question comes at you the same way in different ways, right? But are you noticing that there are certain key principles that keep coming up? You just have to rephrase it for the person who's asking. And so this person who just goes by atheist says, your God is really not a character outside of your mind. What controls you is your own mind, your God. When it is said morality comes from God, it really means from the human mind. The gods as characters humans have created originated in imagination and fantasy. So I said, that's a common claim, but it's self-defeating. If God is just a construct of the human mind, then everything that comes from the human mind, including your reasoning, is just another construct too. You can't dismiss belief in God as imagination without also undermining the reliability of your own thoughts, since both arise from the same allegedly random brain chemistry. So the moral argument isn't saying God is in our heads. It is saying that the very fact that we can recognize goodness, beauty, logic, and moral duty points to a source outside of us. If morality and truth were just mental inventions, they'd have no binding authority. Lying, betrayal, or cruelty would be only unpleasant thoughts, not objectively wrong. So the question isn't whether the mind can imagine God. Of course it can. But why it imagines a perfect moral, transcendent being at all, right? Our imagination testifies to the reality our hearts were made for. Much like hunger, again, implies food, or thirst implies water. I use that analogy because C.S. Lewis used it. And it's a good one. And he's a very smart guy. I'm just standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm just a common guy, just like you, reading and studying, which apparently is a lost art in this day and age. I don't know very many people who read anything any longer, except many of my Christian friends. So we're all in front of our black mirrors, right? And so another one, Stephen. What BS? Morality is genetic unless destroyed or twisted by abuse and or religion. Animals are absolutely moral within the parameters of their species. The killdeer pretending to drag a broken wing to lure predators from its chicks has no God and no Bible. I'm tempted to ask, how would you answer this one? So I said, Stephen, the killdeer isn't doing something moral, it's doing something instinctual. You and I can recognize its behavior as noble or self-sacrificial, but the bird isn't sitting there thinking, this is good, and I ought to do this, right? It's following genetic programming. So morality is more than behavior. It's the awareness of this key word, oughtness, the ability to discern right and wrong beyond survival instinct. A soldier who jumps on a grenade to save his friends doesn't do it for genetic advantage. He does it because love and duty call him to transcend self-preservation. If morality were purely genetic, then no one could be blamed for evil. Cruelty, murder, or betrayal would simply be evolutionary strategies. Yet we instinctively know that moral accountability is quite real. That awareness points beyond biology to something immaterial, a moral lawgiver whose nature defines what is good. So while animal instinct shows nature's design, human conscience shows its designer. And then another Thomas. Jesus was an alien. The Bible was written by advanced alien AI. You and other people think a God is talking to you. It's aliens. They have very advanced science and technology, giving them the power of a god. Aliens, aliens makes as much sense as saying it's all from a god. Anyone who disagrees, tell me, how is my reasoning flawed? So I said, Thomas, I get where you're coming from. We live in an age where technology looks like magic and people are desperate for material explanation for the supernatural. But calling God an alien just kicks the question back a step. You'd still need to explain where they came from, why they're moral and or immoral, and how they could exist before time and space to create the universe itself. Any alien that exists within the created universe is, by definition, not its cause. It's still a contingent being, not a necessary one. The biblical God isn't just a superpowered entity flying around in space. He's the eternal, self-existent ground of all being and morality outside space and time, right? So while aliens might explain phenomena within creation, only the creator explains creation itself. That's the difference between mythology and metaphysics. And then Martin says, God is the least moral creature in that book. If there is a God, he will have to beg my forgiveness. A phrase that was carved on the walls of a concentration camp cell during World War II by a Jewish parishioner. Well, Martin, I've read that quote before too, and it is heartbreaking. The cry of that prisoner wasn't really necessarily atheism, it was anguish. It was the soul's protest that the world should not be this way, and that cry itself is evidence that moral truth is real. If good and evil were just human inventions, then the Holocaust would not be evil. It would just be unpleasant evolution. But something deep in us knows better. That real evil violates a real law that comes from above humanity. It doesn't care about your opinion or what a human opinion is. God didn't create evil, he created free will, and in a world where love is possible, rebellion is possible. At least for now, like I explained in that video. Scripture never hides that God allows horror, but it also shows that he steps into it. The same God who was least moral, like you said, in that man's eyes, hung on a Roman cross, tortured by the world he came to save. That prisoner's cry echoes through time, right? And the cross is God's reply. I am not absent. I have suffered it too. So he's right there with us, folks. And then from an anonymous person. But do objective moral values exist? The claim of objective morality, it's a claim made by people who claim that certain moral precepts are objective because they come from God via the Bible. Never mind that other religions have different values that also claim to be from God via different texts. but they never prove those precepts do in fact come from God. That's taken on faith. To then claim that the existence of objective morality proves the existence of God based on God giving us objective moral values is a circular argument. Okay, so you've actually restated what the moral argument isn't. The argument doesn't start by saying morality comes from the Bible, therefore God exists. That would be circular. Instead, it begins by observing something true of all people everywhere. We recognize that some things are really right or wrong, regardless of what anyone believes about them. That's the ontology question. What makes them real, not how we know them. That's epistemology. If moral truths are objective, that is binding even if no human agrees, then they can't arise from subjective, changing creatures like us. They must be grounded in something transcendent, personal, and unchanging, a moral lawgiver, a true north compass point. The Bible doesn't create that logic, it reveals the identity of that lawgiver. Other religions may differ on the details, but the point stands. Moral objectivity itself points beyond us. The question isn't whether people of different faiths have moral codes, it's whether any moral code can be objectively true without an ultimate moral source. And we're winding down here. I don't think we have too many left here. Richard says, what if morals are as made up as the gods? Some things that are considered morality. Oh, wait, I think we may have done this one. But basically he says, since morality is not universal, it is not proof of God's existence. And I answered this slightly differently here. I may have answered him twice, I don't know. But I said, because truth isn't decided by vote, Richard, something doesn't stop being true just because people disagree about it. If everyone on earth once believed the sun revolved around us, that wouldn't make it true, only widely believed, right? In the same way, if morality were just a product of consensus, the strongest culture could always redefine good however it pleased, which is exactly how history's worst evils justified themselves, but we still recognize them as evil. So the moment we say that was really wrong, we're admitting that morality is more than an opinion. So when I say moral truths are objective, I mean they exist even when we fail to live by them. The way justice still exists even when injustice rules. The question isn't whether we all agree, but whether there's a real right and wrong to agree about. All right. And then Melanie, who seemed pleasant enough, even though she doesn't necessarily like Christianity, says, humanity has existed for millennia without the book of myths created to cull humanity. And so I said, Melanie, humanity existed before the book of physics too, but that doesn't mean gravity wasn't real. The moral argument isn't about how long humans have lived or when a book was written. It's about what best explained why moral truths exist at all. So even ancient people knew right from wrong. That's part of the point. The question is why that moral sense exists across time and culture. If morality is just an evolved illusion, why do we treat it as binding even when it costs us? The Bible didn't invent that. It explains its source. I hope that makes sense to you. And then we had a gentleman, we had a back and forth, and he said, in part of his last statement, you missed my point. God is an invention. Humans evolved on this planet like every other species. All the many religions are human creations. There is no old man in the sky or whatever a particular religion has made up for herself. Morality is part of human survival. We had to learn compassion to be able to survive in groups. Other mammals also exhibit compassion. That is evolutionary. We had to learn to extend it beyond our immediate groups. Another exchange, Oh, wait, no, he's finished right there. Sorry. So I said, this was John, if you remember John a little bit while back. I thought his second point needed addressing again. So I said, John, I actually didn't miss your point. You shifted the playing field. Now you're describing how compassion may have developed, but not why it's objectively good rather than just evolutionarily useful. Again, if morality is only a survival instinct, then it's no different in kind from hunger or fear. Useful, yes, but not binding. Nature selects for survival, not for truth or goodness. If cruelty ever promoted survival better than compassion, just know that evolution would have selected for cruelty instead. So that's why our explanation doesn't address, that's why your explanation doesn't address the moral argument itself. It's not about an old man in the sky. It's about whether moral truths are real or merely convenient. You can explain how humans came to feel moral impulses, but not why we ought to obey them, even when disobeying them would benefit us. That's where a transcendent moral lawgiver provides what evolution can't, an objective foundation for ought. I hope that makes sense. All right, and I think we've handled that one. So let's deal with this one because this doesn't get handled very often. This is one from a person named Joey. He says, religion's indoctrination doesn't merely offer children a set of beliefs. It implants a system of fear. A lot of people believe this, believe it or not. From an early age, many are taught that doubt itself is dangerous, that asking the wrong question might condemn them to eternal suffering. This isn't poetic imagery, it's psychological conditioning. The doctrine of hell becomes a mental trapdoor beneath every moment of uncertainty, and the effects are measurable. Belief in hell correlates with heightened anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. This isn't moral guidance, it's trauma disguised as virtue. And I felt that needed or deserved a response. Let me give you another pretty little photo here. Oh yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it? All right, so this deserved a response. And I said, because, I mean, he is right in some ways. And I said, I understand why you feel that way. Religious trauma is real when belief is twisted into control, but that's not what Christ taught. Man, there's so many people that screw up what Christ taught and it just makes a bad name for everything, for everyone. You know, kind of like somebody, you work for a company and you're working your butt off, right? And there's a couple of Joe Blows in the company that screw up and make everybody else in the company look bad, when really the company overall is good. But because of a couple of people screwing up, you know, whatever, now the whole company has a bad reputation, you know, because people don't look any deeper. So the message of the gospel isn't fear the question, it's seek and you will find, right? Doubt and honest inquiry aren't condemned in Scripture. They're the very tools that lead people toward truth. And so the doctrine of hell was never meant as psychological terrorism. It's the logical consequence of human freedom. It wasn't even created for humans to begin with. It was designed and created for rebellious angelic activity. And the reality that a God of love won't force anyone into his presence who wants to live apart from him. So in that sense, hell isn't divine sadism, it's divine respect for your choice. And fear-based religion does create damage, but Jesus constantly rebuked the Pharisees for exactly that kind of manipulation. The real Christ frees people from fear, not into it. So I'd say what you're condemning is a counterfeit, not the message of the carpenter who laid down his life to break fear's grip entirely. And if you're that concerned about it, correct it. That's what I'm out here doing. You don't, just because somebody is a Christian doesn't mean they shouldn't be corrected. I mean, me too. If I've got something wrong, then I need to be corrected. All right. And then I got a response from a Mia or Maya. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And so she says, you claim a superior moral authority while citing a book that promotes slavery, rape, and numerous other horrible things. My morals are not in question because I'm not the one saying mine are best, but my morals are harm none, love everything. So, yeah, if you're saying you'd have no morals without the fear of hell or promise of heaven, you have no morals. You're a bad person on a religious leash. Um, which I never said in any way, shape, or form in the podcast ever on any of the three of them. So I said, Maya, I get why you feel that way. Religion in the wrong hands has hurt a lot of people, and it's easy to mistake that abuse for God himself. But what you are describing, coercion, fear, hypocrisy, are the very things Jesus condemned in the religious elite of his day. So the Bible doesn't promote evil, it records human evil honestly, even the failures of God's own people, to show why we need redemption. Slavery, for example, in its ancient form, wasn't racial chattel slavery, and the entire arc of Scripture moves towards liberation and equality. The same gospel that inspired abolitionists is what changed the world's moral compass. As for morality, I don't obey God because I'm afraid of hell. I follow him because I've come to know his love, and love reshapes what we call good, right? Fear manipulates, but love transforms, and perfect love casts out all fear. You seem like someone who values compassion deeply, right? And that impulse isn't opposed to God's nature, it reflects it. I just think you've been sold a bill of goods about God that has been slanderous by his adversary, and you've bought into it. And you've tagged all of his believers with that same slander. And maybe it's because you've been treated horribly by people. But I would say all people can treat people badly. It's not just any one group of people. So, and then Kyle, by definition, condoning something is allowing it to happen. Your God allows them to happen. Thus, it condones them. Your God also commands them. Instead of saying, don't own human beings as property, treat women as equals, don't slaughter whole civilization, it outright endorses them. So saying they are always wrong makes me more moral than your God because, as you just admitted, your God thinks rape, slavery, pedophilia, and genocide are perfectly acceptable and moral at times. That is reprehensible. Also, remember, your moral lawgiver is unchanging, meaning if it allowed it once, it allows it always. Wow, how you like that one? That's a lot. So I said, Kyle, I think you're mixing together several different ideas: permission, prescription, and moral law. Allowing something to happen is not the same as approving it. Every parent allows things they hate because they value the child's freedom to learn and choose. God does the same on a cosmic level. The Bible does not endorse things like slavery or violence, it records them, often with painful honesty, to show the reality of human corruption and the cost of sin. So when God gives laws to Israel, many were meant to regulate a brutal culture, not to approve of it. It's a way of limiting evil until hearts can be transformed. And that's why the moral trajectory of Scripture moves toward freedom, equality, and compassion, culminating in Christ, who shattered all systems of human ownership and oppression. And so God's nature doesn't change. He has always hated injustice, but he's also always respected human freedom. And the difference is that his patience with evil is mercy, not consent like you apply. So if he removed free will, he'd remove love itself. And so no, you're not more moral than God. Your own outrage against injustice actually reflects the moral law written on your heart by him. So, let's see. And then I wanted to comment on one of my first reviews on our Facebook page, left by an atheist who clearly doesn't like me and doesn't like what I had to say. I won't quote his stuff. I will just say what I had to say to his thing. I said, Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to leave feedback, though I wish your experience here had been different. For clarity, Pilgrims Grey Chronicles isn't a monetized venture. It actually costs me time, effort, and resources to produce. I do this because I believe truth deserves to be explored and defended, not because it's profitable. If I were chasing money or popularity, I wouldn't be spending hours every week tackling the toughest questions in philosophy, theology, and human nature. The short syllogisms I post are simply summaries, conversation starters, not the full argument themselves. That's what the podcast and long form episodes are for, and dismissing the summary without engaging the full discussion isn't the same as refuting it. As for being thin-skinned or pretentious, anyone is welcome to scroll through my comment sections and judge that for themselves. I respond to hundreds of people, skeptics, believers, and everyone in between, and I do my best to keep the tone respectful, direct, and honest, even when the responses I get are not. And I don't mind disagreement. In fact, I value it. What I care about is genuine, thoughtful dialogue, the kind that helps all of us see a little more clearly. Anyone who approaches in that spirit will always find a willing conversation here. Robert, Pilgrims Grey Chronicles. Anybody's welcome to the end. But if you get vile, disruptive, and hateful and ugly, and your language is terrible, and so on and so forth, yeah, I'm going to boot you out of the end permanently. So, we could turn off the comments and guard our peace. By the way, I'm done with all the comments because I covered pretty much, there were like literally hundreds of comments that were all within that genre that, came in different forms, but basically said the same thing. And so I could turn off the comments and guard my peace of mind, but Christ never avoided the crowd, right? He walked straight into it. So the chaos of argument shows where the world aches anyway, right? So where is God, right? To me is kind of a prayer disguised as protest. And every insult hides a soul that once hoped. That's a way of putting it, right? Hopeful souls like this in this video here I'm showing. So the crowd's noise really only proves that light has entered the square again, right? Mockery doesn't threaten truth, it amplifies it. And I know that 1,000 replies may never change a mind, but one calm sentence or one verse or one glimpse of grace can lodge like a splinter in the soul or the mind until the Spirit turns it to conviction. It's planting seeds, right? Breadcrumbs. And we aren't here to win threads. We're here to plant them, right? Plant seeds. And every word of truth is a seed that may bloom long after all these algorithms have forgotten our names, right? And so, to everyone watching or typing or scrolling or simply listening in the marketplace, I want to give my personal thank you, even if you didn't like what I had to say. You make the dialogue matter. And if these exchanges have been found useful to you or stirred something in you, please share them. I know a lot of you are, but every share helps, every like helps, every comment helps, every good review helps. And let light travel through the noise, right? Because truth does not fear the crowd. It calls to it, right? And Mars Hill still echoes today. We all get out there and we do the Mars Hill thing. And we should, right? This, it shouldn't get like this in the video with all of us acting like this, but you get the general idea. And so with that, I hope everybody has an awesome work week. Again, we would like it if you would hit that subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Spotify or the streaming services, leave us a 5-star review. Continue to follow our work, support our work by, I'm trying to get different ways that I can possibly monetize the show for when I retire. To keep things going. I pump that money right back into the show to spread it out, to get more listeners so that we are heard in a more broader sense, not with money as a motivator, but getting truth out there. I want to reach people with what God has shown me, and I'm just sharing what I've learned while I'm on the long road. And so with that being said, Godspeed to all of you, and have yourselves a great work week. I'm going to do only one show a week from here on out on Monday nights. Won't be doing Wednesdays or Fridays anymore because I've got some deadlines coming up on the album, and my workload at work is going to go through the roof. So I'm going down to just the podcast on Mondays. So sorry. I know many of you will be disappointed, but I will also still try to, in our Monday podcast, share our comment section from time to time. But, one of the best ways you can be a part of the comment section is just go to the YouTube or Facebook comment sections and participate and share and engage in the debate. Just remember to be polite and kind, even if others are not, right? Christians, we should set the example and try to be peaceful. Anyway, love y'all and Godspeed.
Gather round, ye travelers, lend me your ear. A tale of heroes who knew no fear. Through shadowed woods and mountains steep, their legacy lives where the wild winds sweep. Raise your tankards high and sing for the grey pilgrims and what they bring to every corner. Their stories stay. Hail the chronicles of Pilgrims Grey. Through cursed lands where few would tread, the brave walk forth where many fled. Lanterns lit the endless night, their spirits burned a guiding light. Raise your tankards high and sing for the grey pilgrims and what they bring to every corner. Their stories stay. Hail the chronicles of Pilgrims Grey. The laughter fades, yet echoes strong in every heart. Their timeless song, mirrors carried on the ale-soaked breeze. Songs as endless as the trees. Raise your tankards high and sing for the grey pilgrims and what they bring to every corner. Their stories stay. Hail the chronicles of Pilgrims Grey.